Tonight, we revisit one case that has resisted resolution for more than a century. One marriage, one death, one conviction that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Florence Elizabeth Maybrick begins in Liverpool in the autumn months of 1889, though its roots extend back to the spring of 1881, when a young American woman first arrived in England as a bride. Liverpool at this time was the second city of the British Empire in commercial weight, if not in population, a port of close to 700,000 souls, its docks stretching for miles along the Mersey, its warehouses thick with the cotton, sugar and tobacco that moved between the New World and the Old. The city's wealth was built on shipping, and the men who made that wealth, the cotton brokers, the shipping agents, the merchants who dealt in commodities they would never themselves see or touch, built their houses not in the smoke and noise of the city centre, but in the suburbs that ringed it, in Aylesbury, in Sefton Park, in the leafy roads where a man of standing could keep his family at a respectable remove from his place of business. It was in Aylesbury, at a property called Battle Crease House on Riversdale Road, that James Maybrick, a cotton merchant in his middle 40s, established his household after his marriage. The house itself was substantial without being grand, a detached villa of the kind built in great numbers across Liverpool's southern suburbs in the 1860s and 1870s, set back from the road behind iron railings, with a carriage drive, a conservatory, and grounds sufficient for a kitchen garden and stabling. Riversdale Road in 1889 was a quiet thoroughfare of similar properties, home to brokers, solicitors, and merchants of the second rank, men comfortable but not ostentatious, the engine room of Liverpool's commercial class rather than its aristocracy. The Cressington and Aylesbury railway station lay within easy walking distance, allowing the men of these households to travel into the Exchange district each morning and return each evening to wives who oversaw establishments run on a modest complement of servants. In the Maybrick household, a nurse for the children, a cook, and one or two housemaids. It was a household by every external measure of ordinary Victorian respectability. The doctor's bag that would later occupy so much of the proceedings' attention sat, in 1889, unremarked in its place, one object among many in a house that gave no outward sign of what its rooms would come to mean. The early circumstances of Florence Elizabeth Chandler are documented with somewhat greater certainty than is the case for many women, whose stories survive chiefly through courtroom testimony. She was born in Mobile, Alabama, on the 11th of September 1862, the daughter of William G. Chandler, a banker of that city, and his wife Caroline. Her father died while Florence was still an infant, and her mother subsequently remarried, first to a German nobleman, and after his death to a Confederate veteran named Franklin du Barry. Circumstances that gave Florence, by her teenage years, a life divided between the American South and extended periods in Europe. The record establishes that she was raised with the expectations of a young woman of her class and period, education suited to eventual marriage, exposure to European society through her mother's connections, and an upbringing in which appearances mattered as a matter of survival as much as of custom, her mother's financial circumstances having been considerably reduced by the losses of the Civil War. It was aboard the steamship Baltic, crossing the Atlantic in March 1880, that Florence Chandler, then 18, met James Maybrick, a man twice her age and already established in the cotton trade. Their courtship was brief by the standards of the period. They married in London in July 1881. What is not established in any primary source recovered is the precise emotional character of the courtship. Whether the attraction on Florence's part reflected genuine affection, the practical calculations available to a young woman of reduced fortune, or some combination, the record does not allow us to disentangle. What can be stated with confidence is that the marriage produced 2 children, James Chandler Maybrick, born in 1882, and Gladys Evelyn Maybrick, born in 1886, and that by the time the household was settled at Battlecrease House, the marriage had developed strains that would later be examined in exhaustive and unflattering detail before a public courtroom. Among the matters that would surface at trial was James Maybrick's habit of long-standing and known to at least some of his intimates of consuming small quantities of arsenic and strychnine, a practice not unknown among certain Victorian men who believed such substances, taken in measured doses, conferred vigour and counteracted the effects of malaria contracted abroad or simply served as a tonic. Witnesses would later testify to having seen him take such preparations habitually, mixed into food or drink, over a period of years preceding his death. It is this established habit, documented independently of the events that would follow, that the case would come to turn upon, and that brings Florence Maybrick into contact with the substance, and the death that would consume the remainder of her life. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The figure who stands as the case's central and most disputed character is not, strictly, an antagonist in the conventional sense employed by this channel's other accounts. For the central dispute of the Maybrick case is precisely whether the accused was guilty of anything at all. James Maybrick himself, the deceased, requires introduction in his own right. James Maybrick was born in Liverpool in October 1838, one of 7 sons of an engraver of moderate means. Several of the Maybrick brothers achieved considerable commercial or artistic success, the family rising through industry and connection into the ranks of Liverpool's mercantile class. James entered the cotton trade as a young man and spent extended periods in the southern United States, where he conducted business and where, the record indicates, he first developed his habit of dosing himself with arsenic, a practice some accounts attribute to a bout of malaria contracted during his American years. By the time of his marriage to Florence, he was an established cotton broker operating under the name Maybrick & Co., a man of substantial, if not spectacular means, his social standing secured through commerce rather than birth. The domestic situation at Battlecrease House by 1889 was, on the documentary evidence available, an unhappy one. James Maybrick is known to have maintained a long-standing relationship with a woman named Sarah Robertson, by whom he had fathered several children, a relationship that predated his marriage to Florence and that appears, on the surviving evidence, to have continued throughout it. For her part, Florence had, by 1889, formed an association with a Liverpool cotton broker named Alfred Brearley, a friendship that the prosecution would later characterize as an adulterous affair, and that Florence herself, in correspondence later produced at trial, did not entirely deny. The friction in the marriage, by the spring and summer of 1889, was, on this evidence, mutual, long-standing, and known, at least in outline, to those in the couple's social circle. It was against this domestic background that James Maybrick fell ill in late April 1889, following what the record describes as a wet walk home from his office, during which he had also, by his own account, taken a double dose of a strychnine-based tonic. His condition worsened intermittently over the following weeks. By early May, he had recovered sufficiently to travel to Wirral for the Grand National, but his health did not stabilize, and by the second week of May, he had taken to his bed at Battlecrease House under the care of his regular physician, Dr. William Carter, with a Dr. Arthur Hopper called subsequently for a second opinion. Nurses were engaged to assist Florence in the sickroom. It is the conduct of the household during these final weeks of James Maybrick's life, the substances present, the actions taken by Florence Maybrick in particular, and the suspicions that arose among the nursing staff, that would furnish nearly the entirety of the case the prosecution would bring. What the household staff observed, and would later testify to, requires careful statement, since it is on these observations, rather than on any single decisive piece of physical evidence, that the prosecution's case substantially rested. On the 8th of May 1889, a nurse named Alice Yap, employed in the Maybrick household to care for the children, observed Florence Maybrick soaking flypapers, a domestic product of the period containing arsenic, commonly used as an insecticide and also in diluted preparations by some Victorian women as a cosmetic wash believed to improve the complexion, in a basin of water in her bedroom. Florence, when later questioned about this, stated she had been using the preparation as a cosmetic application, a use not unknown among women of the period, though the prosecution would characterize the timing as suspicious in light of what followed. As James Maybrick's condition deteriorated through the following days, the nursing staff and Dr. Hopper became increasingly concerned by the symptoms presenting: persistent vomiting, diarrhea, and a deterioration that did not, in Hopper's clinical judgment, correspond to the diagnosis of dyspepsia and general debility that Dr. Carter had initially offered. On the 11th of May, Nurse Yap intercepted a letter that Florence had written to Alfred Brearley. The letter never reached its intended recipient, having been handed instead to a family member, and its contents, which referenced James's illness in terms the family considered damning, were read by Maybrick relatives who had gathered at the house out of concern. From this point, suspicion within the household crystallized rapidly. Florence's sisters-in-law effectively assumed control of the sickroom, restricting Florence's access to her husband and to the preparation of his food. James Maybrick died at Battlecrease House on the 11th of May 1889. What the medical evidence established was a death preceded by some days of gastrointestinal symptoms consistent with, though not exclusively indicative of, arsenical poisoning, a diagnostic ambiguity that would occupy the trial at considerable length, since James Maybrick's own long-documented habit of self-administering arsenic meant that the presence of the substance in his system, established post-mortem, could not by itself distinguish habitual low-level consumption from a fatal poisoning episode. In the hours following James Maybrick's death, the household searched his effects and Florence's belongings. Among the items recovered were further flypapers, a bottle of meat juice subsequently found to contain a quantity of arsenic exceeding what could be accounted for by accidental contamination, and various powders and preparations whose provenance and intended use would all become subjects of extended forensic and testimonial dispute. Florence Maybrick was placed under informal restraint within the house almost immediately, before any formal charge had been laid, and was formally arrested on a charge of murder on the 14th of May 1889, 3 days after her husband's death. The investigation that followed the arrest proceeded along two converging lines: the chemical analysis of the substances recovered from the house and the assembly of testimony regarding the household's recent history. Liverpool's city analyst, Edward Davies, was engaged to examine the recovered materials, and a post-mortem examination was conducted to establish cause of death. The medical evidence ultimately presented at trial through the testimony of Dr. Carter, Dr. Hopper, and additional medical witnesses called by both prosecution and defense. Among them, Dr. Thomas Stevenson, a toxicologist of considerable standing called by the Crown, whose evidence regarding the quantity and timing of arsenic administration would become central to the proceedings. The investigation's procedural record shows a household transformed within days from a private domestic tragedy into a matter of intense public interest, with the Maybrick family's own actions, the interception of correspondence, the search of Florence's rooms, the restriction of her movement before any formal accusation, themselves later scrutinized as having potentially compromised the evidentiary chain, a concern that some legal historians, examining the case in subsequent decades, have noted without it having altered the trial's outcome. The chain of evidence from sickroom to courtroom passed through the hands of family members with a personal stake in the matter before it reached either police or independent forensic examination, a circumstance the defense would later argue, without success, undermined its reliability. The post-mortem examination of James Maybrick's remains was conducted shortly after death, with the body in a condition permitting full examination, no significant decomposition having intervened. The cause of death was established as consistent with arsenical poisoning, though the medical witnesses were notably divided, both at the inquest and subsequently at trial, on the question of whether the quantity of arsenic recovered from the body was sufficient on its own to account for death. A divergence in expert opinion that became one of the most contested features of the entire proceeding. Dr. Stevenson's evidence for the Crown placed the arsenic found in the body at a level he considered consistent with a fatal dose administered over the period of the final illness. Defense medical witnesses, by contrast, argued that the quantity recovered was insufficient to establish poisoning as the certain cause of death, and that the symptomatic picture was equally consistent with gastroenteritis or with the cumulative effects of James Maybrick's own long-standing habitual arsenic consumption. What is not confirmed in the sources recovered, and what occupied the trial's medical testimony at greatest length, is the precise mechanism by which the arsenic recovered in the body came to be there. Whether through Florence's administration in the days preceding death, through James's own habitual self-dosing, or through some combination, the surviving evidence does not allow to be separated with certainty. This evidential ambiguity, present from the post-mortem onward, would remain the case's defining unresolved feature. Florence Maybrick's trial opened at St. George's Hall, Liverpool, the case being heard there rather than at the Central Criminal Court, owing to the venue arrangements then customary for cases arising within the jurisdiction, on the 31st of July, 1889. Before Mr. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen, a judge of considerable reputation as a legal scholar whose conduct of this particular trial would become, in the assessment of subsequent legal historians, one of the more controversial judicial performances of the Victorian era. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Charles Russell, appearing in a case of unusual public prominence. The defence was conducted by Sir Charles Russell's opposing counsel, Sir Charles Russell. The record here requires correction. The prosecution was in fact led by the Attorney General, while the defence was conducted by Sir Charles Russell QC, one of the most formidable advocates of the period. Public and press interest in the proceedings was intense, extending across the Atlantic given Florence Maybrick's American origin, with newspaper coverage in both Britain and the United States treating the trial as a matter of sustained national interest. The prosecution's case was presented in essentially 4 bodies of evidence. First, the discovery of arsenic-soaked flypapers and the contaminated meat juice within the household. Second, the domestic history of marital discord and Florence's relationship with Alfred Brearley, introduced to establish motive. Third, the medical testimony regarding cause of death and the quantity of arsenic recovered. And fourth, the conduct of Florence Maybrick during her husband's final illness, including testimony from the nursing staff regarding her behavior in the sickroom. The defense argued that the flypapers had a documented innocent cosmetic use, that James Maybrick's own habitual arsenic consumption fully accounted for the post-mortem findings, that the medical evidence did not establish poisoning to a standard of certainty, and that the prosecution's case for motive, while establishing an unhappy and adulterous marriage on both sides, did not establish murder. The defense argument did not succeed. though the reasons for its failure have been subject to considerable subsequent debate among legal historians, a number of whom have identified Justice Stephen's summing up to the jury, delivered after what some accounts describe as visible signs of failing health and mental confusion on the judge's part. Stephen having suffered what is generally understood to have been the onset of a decline that would lead to his being declared of unsound mind within several years of the trial, as having been markedly unfavourable to the defendant, dwelling at length on Florence's adultery in terms that several contemporary legal observers considered to have prejudiced the jury against her on grounds unrelated to the murder charge itself. The jury, after deliberating for slightly over half an hour, returned a verdict of guilty. Florence Maybrick was found guilty of the willful murder of James Maybrick. Mr. Justice Stephen sentenced her to death by hanging, addressing the court at sentencing in terms that referenced both the gravity of the crime, as the jury had found it, and, by several contemporary accounts, the moral failings the trial had exposed in the defendant's conduct as a wife, remarks that some legal observers at the time considered to extend beyond the proper scope of a sentencing address. Here, the case departs from the pattern of most accounts treated by this channel, in that the sentence of death was not, in the end, carried out. Public disquiet over the trial's conduct, the contested medical evidence, and Justice Stephen's summing up generated a substantial petition and review movement on Florence Maybrick's behalf, drawing support in both Britain and the United States, where the American ambassador made representations on her behalf. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, ordered a review of the medical evidence, and on the 22nd of August 1889, days before the scheduled execution, Florence Maybrick's sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. The official ground stated being that while the evidence had not satisfied the Home Office that Florence Maybrick was innocent of administering poison to her husband, it had not established with sufficient certainty that the administered poison had caused his death, given James Maybrick's own established habitual consumption of the same substance. It is worth stating plainly what the surviving record makes clear. This was not an acquittal, nor a finding of innocence, but a commutation grounded in residual doubt as to whether the prosecution had proven its case to the standard the medical evidence, properly weighed, could support, a distinction that left Florence Maybrick legally guilty of murder while leaving the underlying facts of the case substantially unresolved, a tension that has animated nearly every subsequent examination of the matter. Florence Maybrick served 15 years of penal servitude, the greater part of it at Aylesbury Prison, before her release in January 1904. She returned to the United States, where she lived for the remainder of her life, initially attempting, without sustained success, to capitalize on her notoriety through public lectures and a memoir titled Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, My 15 Lost Years, published in 1905, before withdrawing from public life entirely in her later years, living in increasing poverty and isolation in rural Connecticut under a changed name. She died there in October 1941, largely forgotten by the public that had once followed her case with such intensity, her death attracting only modest notice in the press of the period. The case entered the historical record almost immediately upon its conclusion, becoming a fixture of Victorian true crime literature and, in subsequent decades, a recurring subject of legal scholarship, concerned with the conduct of Justice Stephen, the standards of forensic toxicology available to late Victorian courts, and the broader question of how a defendant's sexual conduct was permitted to influence juries in cases ostensibly concerned only with the question of murder. Several books have treated the case at length, among them Trevor Christie's Etched in Arsenic and more recent reassessments examining both the original trial record and the later controversy surrounding James Maybrick's purported connection to an unrelated and far more notorious case, the so-called Maybrick Diary. a document purporting to be a confession by James Maybrick to having been Jack the Ripper, which surfaced decades after these events and whose authenticity remains, on the documentary evidence available, unresolved and disputed among historians, a controversy that lies outside the scope of the trial examined in this account, but that has kept the Maybrick name in continued public circulation. The case's most direct institutional consequence concerned the conduct of Justice Stephen himself, whose evident decline during the trial contributed to subsequent informal scrutiny of the practice of allowing judges to continue sitting without independent assessment of fitness, though no formal reform can be traced directly and solely to this case. More broadly, the Maybrick trial has been cited repeatedly in legal scholarship as an instructive instance of the difficulties Victorian courts faced in distinguishing, through the forensic toxicology then available, between habitual, low-dose consumption and fatal administration of a substance, an evidentiary problem that would continue to trouble poisoning trials for decades afterward. In how the case is most often remembered, Florence Maybrick herself has frequently been reduced to a category rather than a person: the American adventuress, the unfaithful wife, a cautionary figure whose guilt or innocence has mattered to subsequent commentators chiefly as a vehicle for arguing about Victorian judicial standards or sexual double standards, rather than as a question about the fate of one particular woman who spent 15 years in prison for a crime the state itself was never able to prove to its own satisfaction. It is difficult, examining the record now, not to feel that whatever she did or did not do in that sickroom in May 1889, she has been allowed her own voice in the matter only rarely. The case of Florence Elizabeth Maybrick was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered, the sentence was commuted before execution, and 15 years of imprisonment followed in 1889. The case became part of the national record. It has not left,